So today we're going to talk about the last 3 months of reading, which sounds like a lot, but in one of the months I read one book. So I figured I do want to try to keep a log through these monthly wrap-up videos, just of the things that I'm reading. Most of them I spoke about already in other videos, so it really might not be so interesting for you if you already watched the previous videos. But if you're here for the first time, then hi. Let's talk about these books. We're rolling back first to April, and I read one book. Hi, this is my dog. Oh, sweetie. Oh, I love you too. Shiv, mommy. So the first book I read in April was Nocia Dream by Agustin Fernandez Malo. This is translated by Thomas Bunstead, translated from Spanish. This was the one and only book that I read in April, but it was such an interesting read. A lot of these I'm very, it's been a while, so I don't have such clear thoughts in the front of my mind. But this is a very strange, multi-stranded, very eclectic story collection, I would say, or it's described as an encyclopedia, a survey, a deranged anthropology. What I loved about this book was mostly the setting. It takes place along US Route 50 and in the desert around Las Vegas and Nevada, which I'm from Nevada, so I was very drawn to this setup. It keeps coming back to this poplar tree that is in the middle of that desert stretch. There's this like stretch of road between two brothels, and there's like a poplar tree there. And so he writes about this poplar tree with like hundreds of shoes on it. And so each of our characters that we're kind of going back and forth between all somehow find themselves related to this area and related to this tree in some way with the shoes. Many narrative strands. I highlighted a lot and dog-eared a lot of things. It has this kind of dreamy quality to it, but also like a harsh critique on American life. And yeah, like a loneliness and a strive for the American dream. It's foggy in my brain. It's a very weird book. If you like vignette-y, very weird, unrelated, sometimes like super scientific, or it's referencing a lot of things. Like it's a big collage. If you like that kind of thing, then I would say definitely give this a try. It was very fun and interesting, and one of the weirder things that I've ever read, and apparently it's part of a trilogy, I think. Okay, then moving on to May, I had, the first book was Optic Nerve by Maria Gainza. This was a book club pick for Katie James's book club. Another kind of fictional essay collection, meaning like it reads like essays, but they contain sort of fictional stories inside of them. Maria Gainza is an art critic, so she's writing a lot about art. She's from Argentina, also translated from Spanish, and each one is sort of a portrait of an artist, but she's connecting that to some short piece of fiction. So I looked up a lot of like new artists that I didn't know anything about, Argentinian artists, painters from different forms. I think if you go in expecting it to be like a novel, I mean, says it's a novel, but if you think about it like searching for a through line or something that works really cohesively, I think you might find it disappointing. But if you read it more like a collection of art essays, then you would probably enjoy it. So for me, I enjoyed it in that aspect. And then I read Checkout 19 by Claire Louise Bennett, and this was amazing. I was a little bit intimidated by Claire Louise Bennett. I know she was very like big brain energy kind of. It's reductive, I think, to say stream of consciousness, but like that kind of writing, and I knew that I would really like that, but I just thought maybe I wouldn't get it or it would fly over my head. And I read this with Modern Ajuma. So Yenna and I read this together, and it was really fun to just chat back and forth on Instagram about it. And yeah, I love a buddy read, although I'm really bad at them normally. And this one I did pretty well. I highlighted a lot here. Wow, to explain what this book is about, it's a book about books and a book about reading. It's a love letter to books, books as objects, books as endless places to lose yourself, a source of dreams. I don't know, if you love reading, I think this book, you would love this book. It's very listy. She's like a master of lists. And there's one section where she's reflecting on herself and she's like, at this point I hadn't read this author, but I had read this author. At this point I hadn't read this, but I had read this. And like, it's just 50 pages almost of like books to add to your list to read, especially if Claire Louise Bennett recommends them. I feel like she's someone you want to take a recommendation from. Follow a main character that I don't remember even if she has a name. Now I don't know. The language is just beautiful. Like, it's really about the sentences, and sometimes very, very long sentences without any punctuation. But in this, I didn't find it exhausting. I found it so fun, and it really made me love reading. So I'm sorry that I can't really explain to you what this book is about, but because it's just about many things, and it's very meta in the sense that also she's like writing a novel, and she's writing stories within the book, and within stories within stories. Yeah, it's really, really good. That's all I can say. And then I read This Is Not Miami by Fernanda Melchor, which I've spoken about pretty extensively in a video. I think it's like what I'm reading and wearing in Paris or something. I'll put it up here. And I did like a pretty long monologue about that book. I don't have it with me because I passed it on to my friend Grace in Paris. Actually, I need to catch up with her and see if she's read it or not. But this is a collection from Fernanda Melchor about kind of continuing on her fascination with crime and violence. If you've read her novels, Hurricane Season or Paradise, you know that she is kind of obsessed with violence and like thinking about what creates it, and the stories behind criminals also. So this is narrative nonfiction. So she's taking real stories, but instead of just giving you kind of a newspaper clipping about it, she's creating a narrative out of it. So the question is also, what is fiction, what is nonfiction? In a way, there's nothing in the stories that didn't happen, but in order to retell a story to someone, you make it a fiction. Like, you include parts of your own imagination inside. So I found it really great. I saw in my video some comments of people that thought that it less worked. For me, it really worked. I was so compelled. Some of the stories are like very dark and violent in nature, but I just found it so readable, and it was really like I was obsessed with it. It has like an obsessive quality to it. Really interesting things about Veracruz, this place in Mexico that she's from, and almost all of the stories I think revolve around that place, where the crime rate is really high. It was just really fascinating, and I love her writing, and I listened also to a podcast with her, and it was super fascinating. So yeah, that was great. I loved it. I really loved it. Okay, we get to June, and I read 5 books in June. So this was like my reading renaissance month. First was a poetry collection by Sharif Shanahan called Trace Evidence. I had this as an ARC from NetGalley, but it's already published. This is a poetry collection about queerness, Sharif's experience being first generation born in the US, and his mom is from Morocco. Deals a lot with like immigrant experience, queer experience, and those two things in relationship to each other, what it means to live in America as an immigrant or someone from a family of immigrants. Was also in a pretty intense bus crash in Morocco, and there's like a really powerful poem about that crash and how it reflected on him. I don't know, the meaning or the experience of being very close to death, because he has quite a dark nature, kind of an affinity for the question of being alive or dying, and maybe sometimes desiring to not be alive or to not exist, which sounds really heavy. So like that with this experience of being very, very close to death. But I really enjoyed the experience of reading it, and a lot of it was very moving and touching. And I want to read more queer poetry, and especially like people of color, so that was, yeah, great and amazing to find like a new poet that I didn't know anything about, although he is quite well known, just not to me. I read Eileen. This is Ohad's copy in Hebrew, so this is not what my copy looked like, and I did read it in English. But yeah, Ottessa Moshfegh, Eileen, was her first novel, and I loved it. I loved it like every other Moshfegh book that I've read. She just writes in a way that you get so sucked in to the characters, and she writes characters so well, and all the flaws and just all the kind of disgusting things about human beings. And Eileen is very dark. She's in her 60s, and she's recalling her time when she's like in her 20s. And she's working in a prison for young men, and she hates her job, and her mother is dead, and her father is like a raging alcoholic and also very mentally unstable. And she just is really, really hates her life, and hates everything, and it has a lot of weird body issues and body image issues. And she becomes obsessed with this really kind of beautiful, glamorous woman named Rebecca, that comes to work also in the prison as like an educator. And this book is about just this obsession that she has with Rebecca, and I won't tell you what happens, but it gets insane and crazy. So this is just the kind of like plot book I like. Like Ottessa Moshfegh writes characters so well that both dialogue and plot to me is really enjoyable, when normally I like to read things that don't really have a plot. It was just, yeah, amazing and wild, and a really great book to read like with a group of friends maybe and talk about it. And then I read, so this started my kind of like desire for more fiction and more like plot stories. So I picked up Cursed Bread by Sophie McIntosh. This is the cover. I don't love this cover, so let's take it off. This was, I spoke about it in a video as well, that I read it directly after Eileen. And it's a sort of similar situation where we're following a main character who's like unhappy with her circumstances in life. This is in a small French village, probably in 1950s, loosely based on a historical event where a small town in France was mass poisoned, and there's many different theories about what happened, but no one really knows. So Sophie Mackintosh is kind of using that as a jumping off point for this historical fiction novel. And we're following this main character who is unhappy in her marriage. She feels like she wants to be wanted by her husband, and he just doesn't respond to her in any way. And she's very unhappy, and this couple moves in. I think he's an ambassador, and the wife's name, now I don't remember any of the characters' names. Violet is the Rebecca of this book. So this is very similar in the sense that it's one character that becomes obsessed with another female character. In this case, she's obsessed with this couple, and kind of what it triggers in her and her sexuality and her hunger for something vibrant in her life. And it also gets cuckoo crazy bananas, and was very kind of similar setup to me as Eileen. So I think because I read this one second, it got a little bit of a disadvantage, but it is different also, and the writing is very luscious, descriptive, very sensory, decorative. A lot of it is very, very beautiful. It's just it's heavily in that style. So if you like a cleaner language, you probably would find this maybe exhausting. It was very entertaining also in the theme of obsession, and yeah, it was very entertaining. I definitely recommend it as a good novel to just kind of get lost in. I'm sweating, but we get to the next one. We're almost at the end. Is Mother Dead by Vigdis Hjorth. She's a Norwegian author who translated this. Charlotte Barsland, translated from Norwegian. This was given to me by Jessica's Bookstack. This is a proof copy, but it's old. It's been out already for a while. This book was incredible. I never read something like this before, and I read it on the train in Italy, and I just cried after reading it, and while I was reading it, especially towards the end. It's like, I don't even know how to explain how much I loved this book. We're following this main character who is estranged from her family. So she's an artist, she's a painter, and she moved away from her small town in Norway when she was in her 20s, and that was already a very bad thing to do in her family. You didn't leave, you should stay, She was also married, and then she abandoned her husband and her family, and she moved to the States with another man to pursue an art career. And then after that, she made a few paintings called Mother and Child or something, and they were exhibited in Norway, and her family took it as, her mother especially took it as a huge insult. And then her father died, and she didn't come back to his funeral or to see him before he died. So basically, she hasn't spoken to her mother or her sister in decades, and they completely have cut her out. It also looks a lot at her childhood and the relationship with the mother, and why it was so hard for her to be around her. Why she would want to kind of disconnect herself. But anyway, the setup of the novel is that there's a retrospective on her in her hometown. So she goes back to Norway, and she becomes obsessed, again, the obsession theme. She becomes obsessed with reconnecting with her mother. So she's calling her, she never doesn't answer, and she starts to stalk her mother, who she hasn't seen in 30 years or something. And she kind of becomes obsessed with, who is this woman that is my mother? Who is this older woman now? Who is this elderly woman now who was my mother almost? I'm having a hard time to describe describe it, but she stalks her mom, basically, and it's so fascinating, told sometimes in very small fragments. Reminds me a little bit of what it's like to read Pure Color by Sheila Heti, in the pace of it and like the way it's literally formatted. This just broke my heart. It was really touching, it was really moving. I wanted to reread it immediately after I finished it. Yeah, just the idea of family. Is it possible to be strangers from the people that, you know, are your family, and or is it possible to reconnect after such a intense separation? And also, like, what is the role of art? Like, should art be truthful? Should art be respectful to the people it depicts? What should be more important, truth or comfort? Yeah, and it's also just escalates towards the end, and the build-up is just so intense. Like, there's like a thick energy between our main character and trying to reach her mother, like after stalking her. And yeah, I won't spoil it for you, but it's just really a really great book, and the voice is so unique and interesting. And yeah, it was a book that like impacted me so much, and now I don't understand how to put that into words, but maybe that's a good thing, and I just don't know what else to say about it other than it's probably one of my favorite books of the year. Last but not least, I read this book yesterday, finished it yesterday. Welcome to America by Linda Bostrom Knausgaard, who's the wife of Karl Ove Knausgaard, which some people don't know that he has a wife that's also an author. Tiny little book. Renee sent me this book, so I read this book in New Zealand, and she sent this to me a while ago with a few other books, and I was just now getting to it. And I just uploaded my last video that's called like I read this book and I cried for 10 minutes straight after, and this is that book. It was incredible. This is a mighty tiny. You can write in 124 pages something so strong and moving. We're following an 11-year-old girl named Ellen who stops speaking because she was wishing night after night, praying to God that her father would die, because he was a heavy drinker and also was very mentally unstable and mentally ill, and would kind of carried this fear in the family of him, and was quite dangerous, had a quite dangerous presence. And so she wanted him to die. So one day he dies, and I'm not sure it's a suicide or not, although I know it's been, like, for some people it's very clear that he killed himself, and I didn't understand that completely. But she feels that she's responsible for his death because she wished it. So she stops speaking and she chooses silence throughout the whole book. And it's a really intense, vivid, claustrophobic portrait of a grieving family, a mother, our main character Ellen, and her brother, and how they all grieve this death in a different way. And for me, it was just so touching and moving, and it's really bleak and heavy. Like, trigger warning on this book, it's dark. Something about, you should watch my last video because I had better thoughts about it. I articulated it better. But it's just, wow, it's so powerful. The writing is amazing. It's very slim and like not a lot of words on the page. You can read it in one sitting and it will break your heart, and you just want to reach into this book and grab Ellen and take her home with you. The silence being the root for this grief to be processed within this 11-year-old girl was just so touching, and I found it really relatable, and it was just, yeah, it was so good. I recommend this to everyone. Thanks for watching. Those are the books that I've read in the last 3 months. Yeah. What did you read recently? Put it downstairs and let me know. Yeah. That's all. Bye.